students, welcome to another lesson presented by the Learning Depot. In today's lesson, we will learn about the adjective clause. From a previous lesson, we learned that a subordinate or dependent clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate, and it can function as one part of speech. In today's lesson, we will learn about a subordinate or dependent clause that functions as an adjective, and this is the adjective clause. Today you will learn what an adjective clause is, how to identify an adjective clause. You will also learn about the two types of adjective clauses, and when to use commas to set off the adjective clause. Let's begin. What is an adjective clause? An adjective clause, also known as an adjectival or relative clause, is a dependent clause that modifies a noun or a pronoun. In effect, this clause functions as one part of speech, the adjective. Like in this example, spots where no trees grew were plainly visible. The adjective clause is where no trees grew, describing or modifying the subject of the sentence and the noun, spots. How do you identify an adjective clause? How do you pick it out in a sentence? You can identify the adjective clause in the sentence by looking at the subordinators, also called connectives or conjunctions, that begin or trigger the clause. Adjective clauses will always begin with a relative pronoun, such as that, which, who, whom, whose, etc., or with a relative adverb, such as where to describe place, when to describe time, and why to describe reason. These subordinators connect the clause to the noun or pronoun it modifies. Let's look at some more examples. People who have marketable skills can always find employment. In this sentence, the adjective clause, who have marketable skills, is modifying people. We can see that the relative pronoun who is acting as both the trigger or the subordinator, but also the subject of the clause. And of course, have is the verb of the clause. Remember that a clause must have a subject and a verb. Let's look at another example. Paris, which is known as the city of lights, is full of life. In this example, you can see that the adjective clause is set off by commas, which is known as the city of lights, describing Paris. This adjective clause also begins with a relative pronoun, which. Let's go on to another example. The author, whose autobiography was released last week, is coming to our local bookstore. In this example, the adjective clause, whose autobiography was released last week, is modifying author, and the subordinator that triggers the clause is the relative pronoun whose. Let's look at another example. That was the time when we were young and carefree. Can you pick out the adjective clause in this sentence? That's right, when we were young and carefree. When we were young and carefree is modifying the noun time. And notice that a relative adverb, when, is used as a subordinator. It triggers the clause, and the subject of the clause is we. Let's go on to another example. Here's the little cafe where you and I fell in love. Can you identify the adjective clause? That's right, where you and I fell in love. In this example, the subordinator is the relative adverb where, an adverb of place, triggering the adjective clause where you and I fell in love. You and I is the subject of the clause. Where you and I fell in love is describing the noun cafe. My dog's incessant barking is the reason that I cannot study. In this example, the adjective clause is that I cannot study, modifying the word reason. A word of caution here: when using an adjective clause to modify the word reason, do not use why, because why already means reason. So don't say the reason why, say the reason that. Now you may have noticed that some of these adjective clauses were set off by commas, while others were not. There is a reason for this. Let's go on to the two types of adjective clauses. Adjective clauses can be classed in two ways: restrictive, also known as essential, defining, or identifying, or non-restrictive, also known as non-essential, non-defining, or non-identifying. You will note that different grammar books or style guides will call them different names. Let's look at these two examples. My friend who drives an old Cadillac is buying a new Buick. In this example, you'll notice that there are no commas setting off the adjective clause, who drives an old Cadillac. The reason is that this clause is essential when defining my friend. Since I have many friends, you would not know who I am talking about. But if I say who drives an old Cadillac, you know who my friend is. In this example, the adjective clause is restricting the meaning to my friend, the one who drives the old Cadillac. Now let's change it around. If I say Marty, who drives an old Cadillac, is buying a new Buick, the adjective clause is non-restrictive. Notice that it is set off by commas, and I can remove it from the sentence, Marty is buying a new Buick, because it is not necessary to say that Marty drives an old Cadillac to identify Marty. We are already naming him. Let's further explain how we use commas to set off the adjective clause. This is important to know because depending on the information provided by the clause, commas will be used to set off the clause. Let's start with the premise that whatever is enclosed inside the commas can be removed, and the meaning of the sentence, or more importantly, the noun or pronoun that the clause is modifying, will not be affected. If you know this, it'll be easier for you to determine if the adjective clause is necessary or essential to the sentence. And by the way, this only applies when the adjective clause is interrupting the sentence. As a rule, restrictive clauses are not set off by commas. They are essential to the meaning of the sentence, especially because they are modifying the noun or pronoun. A restrictive clause identifies, defines, and is essential to preserve the meaning of the noun or pronoun it is modifying. The following sentences have adjective clauses that are restrictive or essential. The film that is set in the 1950s is one of my favorite movies. My aunt who recently retired is on a cruise to the Caribbean. The house that is on the hill is haunted. Again, notice that we cannot set off the adjective clause with commas because we cannot remove the clause. The clause is limiting or modifying. The clause is essential. It's identifying the film. What film? The one that is set in the 1950s. Which aunt? I have many aunts. The one who recently retired. Which house? The house that is on the hill. If we remove the essential adjective clause, we would be removing essential information. Now let's look at some examples of the same sentences, but instead we will use non-restrictive or non-essential adjective clauses. Grease, which is set in the 1950s, is one of my favorite movies. You see the difference? The adjective clause is set off by commas, which is set in the 1950s. I can remove that clause. It is non-restrictive, and I still know what movie I'm talking about. It's Grease, the movie Grease. Aunt Rachel, who recently retired, is on a cruise to the Caribbean. Again, you see that the adjective clause is non-restrictive, non-essential. We can remove it, and we still identify the noun, the proper noun in this case. Aunt Rachel is on a cruise to the Caribbean. Gray Manor, which is on the hill, is haunted. Again, I can remove the restrictive adjective clause and the sentence still makes sense, and the noun that was being modified by the adjective clause still makes sense and is still identified. We do not need witches on the hill to identify Gray Manor. Some things to remember before we end the lesson: that the adjective clause must be placed next to the noun it modifies. If it is placed incorrectly, you will have a misplaced modifier. Remember that the relative pronoun who is used to describe a person. Don't use the relative adverb why to describe reason. You don't say it's the reason why. You wouldn't say that. The reason that. Another thing to remember is that many grammar or style guides recommend that you do not use which for restrictive clauses. It is preferable that you use that. And lastly, do not confuse the appositive noun clause for the adjective clause. The appositive noun clause is not describing the noun. In essence, it is duplicating the noun. Don't forget to go back and review the parts of the video that you did not understand, and if you have questions or comments, leave them down below and I'll make sure to answer them. And please subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you will be notified every time I upload a new video. And please like and share so that others may learn about my channel. I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you real soon. Bye bye.